For centuries, Irish folklore wasn't written in books or filmed on sound stages. It lived in stories, passed from voice to voice, family to family, village to village. These stories were shaped by memory, interpretation, and imagination. They changed a little every time they were told. In 1959, those stories met Hollywood. The film Darby O'Gill and the Little People takes elements of traditional Irish folklore, leprechauns, banshees, and fairy magic, and packages them into a Disney fantasy film. And while the movie is charming and entertaining, it also gives us an interesting opportunity to examine what happens when folklore moves from local storytelling traditions into mass entertainment. For this analysis, I'm using a simple framework: folklore transmission versus cultural packaging. In traditional societies, folklore spreads organically. It doesn't have a single author, and it doesn't belong to a corporation. Stories evolve through repetition and reinterpretation. But when folklore becomes a film, something changes. The story becomes fixed. The characters become standardized. And the myth becomes part of a global entertainment product.
The first look I got at him was in the old ruins on the top of Knocknashega. And what did he look like, Darby? Oh, just like any other leprechaun, only he been the king of them all, had a little gold crown on his head.
Tell me something, Darby. Did he have a long tail and a cloven hoof?
Now, who ever heard of a leprechaun having a...
Oh, that's it.
In Darby O'Gill, we see this transformation most clearly in the character of King Brian, the leprechaun leader.
Now, the night was dark, and the mountain was covered with mist, and the moon was no bigger than the light from a halfpenny candle, and his face as fierce as fire. King Brian, me old boy, oh, I've got you at last, and I'm not going to let you go until you grant me the favour of 3 grand wishes. And me first wish is you'll grant me health.
Granted.
Now, me second wish is a small wish indeed, but it means a lot to me. I want a big crop of potatoes.
Granted.
And me third wish is for the crock of gold.
Granted.
Now, what about your fourth wish? My fourth wish? I'd like a crock of gold like this for my good friend, Tom Kerrigan.
Is that your fourth wish?
It is.
Three wishes I'll grant you, great wishes are small, but you wish a fourth one and you lose them all.
In Irish folklore, fairy beings, including leprechauns, are rarely harmless. They're unpredictable, sometimes mischievous, and occasionally dangerous. These figures exist in a morally ambiguous world where humans and supernatural beings interact in uneasy ways. Disney softens this ambiguity. King Brian becomes theatrical, humorous, and playful. He still tricks Darby, but he does so in a way that feels more like a magical game than a dangerous encounter with something from another realm. This shift makes the story accessible to a family audience, but it also changes the tone of the original folklore. Folklore often carries a sense of caution. It reminds people that the world is mysterious and sometimes hostile. Fairy stories weren't always comforting. They were warnings about crossing boundaries between the human world and something older. One of the most interesting moments in the film actually preserves a piece of that darker tradition, the banshee scene.
The banshee!
In Irish folklore, a banshee isn't a monster in the modern horror sense. She's a supernatural messenger. Her wail signals that someone is about to die. The banshee represents the thin line between life and death, the living and the spirit world. In Darby O'Gill, the banshee sequence is surprisingly eerie for a Disney film. The carriage, the atmosphere, and that tension hints at something closer to traditional folklore than most of the movie's lighter moments. It's as if the older myth briefly pushes its way through the polished surface of the Hollywood adaptation. And that tension is what makes this film interesting, because folklore doesn't disappear when it's adapted. It transforms. Stories that once belonged to small communities become part of global media. The myth changes shape so it can travel farther, reach wider audiences, and survive in new cultural environments. In that sense, Darby O'Gill and the Little People sits at an unusual crossroad. It's not purely traditional folklore, and it's not purely modern fantasy either. It's a transitional moment where oral storytelling traditions meet 20th century cinema. The result is something a little strange and a little fascinating.
But what am I going to do with myself? And me cut off in me prime?
A piece of Irish culture mythology filtered through American filmmaking. And maybe that's part of the larger lesson here. Stories move. They travel across generations, across languages, across cultures. And every time they move, they change a little. Folklore becomes literature, literature becomes film, film becomes pop culture. But beneath those layers of adaptation, you can still see traces of the older stories, echoes of the fireside tales that came long before movie cameras and studio lights. And sometimes, if you look closely enough, you can still hear them. Today, when most people think of a leprechaun, they picture something fairly harmless. A small man dressed in green, a cheerful trickster guarding a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, a symbol of luck. That image is everywhere. Cartoons, holiday decorations, advertising, and pop culture. But historically, Irish fairy folklore described something much stranger. The leprechaun was part of a larger world of supernatural beings known as the fairy folk, creatures believed to live alongside humans in a parallel realm that occasionally intersected with the human world. These beings weren't simply characters in stories. For many communities in Ireland, they were understood as inhabitants of specific places in the landscape. Certain locations were believed to belong to them, Ancient earthworks called ring forts, sometimes known as fairy forts, were thought to be entrances to their domain. Lone hawthorn trees in fields were sometimes called fairy trees and were left standing even when everything around them was cleared. Disturbing these places was believed to risk angering whatever lived there. In other words, the fairy folk, including figures like leprechauns, were once imagined not just as magical creatures, but as neighbors occupying a hidden layer of the landscape.
So that's Darby O'Gill.
It is.
Over time, that worldview changed. As folklore moved into literature, tourism, and eventually modern entertainment, the unsettling aspects of the fairy world softened. The unpredictable spirits tied to specific hills, trees, and ancient ruins gradually transformed into something more approachable. The leprechaun became smaller, friendlier, and luckier.
Come on now, hurry up!
What had once been a mysterious being tied to the land became a cheerful cultural symbol, one that could appear on cereal boxes, greeting cards, and holiday decorations. But traces of the older mythology still remain beneath the surface, because before the leprechaun was a lucky mascot, he was part of a much older idea that the landscape itself might contain hidden inhabitants, and that humans were never entirely alone in the places they lived.